So while we were doing the 6800, Tom assigned a really young guy out of school by the name of Bill Minch um, to work with me and see what we could do to make some I/O functions. Well, Bill and I sat down, and I knew that in order to make this processor control copiers or run my keyboards and my screens and send stuff, I had to make programming ways of talking to real things. And we invented a product called the PIA, which had a couple of major characteristics. Every bit could be an input or an output bit based on what you program. We had put in edge detecting, because I knew edge detection was important. We put handshaking in, because I knew handshaking was important. We did that product in 3 months. It worked the first time. And we filed a bunch of patents that were basic, right? If you look at everybody's hardware today, they copied all those features, because those are the features you needed to go from a computer which doesn't know crap, right?
So was this all done in Rubylith and hand-drawn at this point?
Oh, yeah, shit. Back in those days, that's the only thing we had, right? I mean, no, the guys like Mensch had a designer, would have a bunch of guys that were doing layout for him, and then they'd check the layout, right? I lost you again, by the way, if that matters.
But she's doing that so we can watch you pretty exclusively.
Full screen for you. The star.
You sure? You sure? All right. I like.
How old were you? How old were you at that time?
Too old. I'm the oldest guy in the personal computer industry. Did you know that? I really was.
Living.
What?
The oldest living guy.
No. In the personal computer industry, I was the oldest guy, right? In the sense that, Irving Gould's dead, right? But Irving Gould didn't do anything other than provide money, right? I'm talking about the guys doing the work. We were able to capture the young minds, right? The 15 to 30-year-olds, right? And they're the guys that drove all of that stuff, that did the silicon. I think the oldest guy that was working on the silicon for me was probably 31, right? And, I was 40 at that time. So the PIA was definitive, right? We finished the 6800, we finished the PIA. Then Motorola discovered that they didn't have anybody who knew why we did it. Okay, so I knew why we did it, because that was my job, because I was doing it for me. So I taught the first classes and educated a bunch of people about the way you would sell this kind of product. And of course, what I was selling was the PIA and the functions of the PIA with the computer driving it, right? And I sold that because I had convinced everybody that I was the only guy that knew how to teach people. I wound up going to all the major accounts, and so I sold HP, NCR, Bailey, I'm trying to think of Ford Motor Company, all these guys, Tektronix, all these guys signed up for our product because the 6800 could control things, right? Now, this is a crucial part of making the 6502 happen, and the reason I'm taking you through this so laboriously is because, okay, I'm here trying to build a product that I want to be able to make something happen with. We've built the PIA, I've been able to build some demo equipment so I can show everybody how it works, and I've got this customer population of really smart guys who understand it, right? So I had the occasion to go to each of the key companies, and they would gather all their bright engineers in the room, because the best and the brightest wanted to know about microprocessors, because they were reading about it in the press and they didn't have a clue what they were. So I was invited to spend a day with each of these teams. And so I would get up and I'd explain the 6800, and we'd talk about architecture, and then we'd talk about why the PIA worked, and then how you use those sort of things, and ROMs and RAMs. And then at the end of the session, I would open it up to questions. And the first question that came up and said, okay, it's wonderful. The PIA is inexpensive and it'll do this job and everything else. But for $300, which is what they were charging for the processor, you can't replace random logic. You keep talking about replacing random logic, but you can't do it with a microprocessor. So, being a smart guy, I said, okay, guys, I'm going to write the instruction set for the 6800 on the wall, and you've got to take out a third of it, minimum, if you want to make a cheap microprocessor. And we sat down and we would design this system on the wall, right, or in the blackboard there. And they all came up with the same conclusion, right? They were all talking about the same thing. So I had a whole bunch of the smartest people in the United States all helping me define what was a low-cost microprocessor, right? The problem is that Motorola's management found out I was doing this, because I didn't ask them. And the guys who had done the computer wanted to go in the mini computer business. So they didn't want me going out and creating a $25 computer, because it wouldn't help them in the mini computer business. So they got Motorola's top management to write me a letter saying, you cannot work on this cheap microprocessor anymore. That was the biggest favor those guys could have done me, right? Because what I did is I wrote them back a memo saying, good, you abandoned the product. I'm going to do it for myself. I sent them a formal notice I'm going to do it for myself. And I went out and started finding people who would help me do it. Well, it turned out that one of the guys I talked to was John Pavenin, the guy from GE that invented the magnetic calculator. But John had trained himself in semiconductors, had a semiconductor company was making the world's biggest, best calculator chips in P-channel, because he had discovered projection alignment, and he taught himself process as good as Grove, right? And because he was a computer guy, he understood what I was talking about, right? When I go talk to LJ7 or some of these guys, they were semiconductor guys. They didn't have a clue, any more than Motorola guys did. But Pavenin absolutely understood why a cheap microprocessor would work, and why it would sell, and why it was important. And so he said, okay, I'm going to go do it for you. And by the way, I told him one of my specs was I needed 5-volt only in-channel. And he said, well, I don't have a process like that, but you come back and bring your team, and by the time you get the microprocessor done, I'll have the process. So I took one guy from Motorola with me, and Bill Mensch, who came along, and Bill spent about half his time working with the guys in the process. Terry Holt worked all the time in the process. John worked in the process. It only took us less than 9 months to design the 6800, 6502, the VIA, which was the second generation, the RAM-ROM I/O, which Atari used. We did all of those with a small team in less than 9 months, and John was there, right? He had the process that we needed to make a 5-volt part. And John, this is just a great time in my history, because I'm working with a guy that understands. So I told John, because I was doing the marketing at that point too, that I wanted to introduce it at a show, and that Motorola was still charging $300 and Intel was still charging $300. I wanted to go to a show and say, you can come to this show and I will sell you a 6502 or a 6501 for $25. Okay? And we put that ad in a whole bunch of paper, right? And remember, we're totally ahead of everybody now, right? We're $25 everybody else. So because we were doing the advertising, and because there was a whole bunch of technology people that were having fun writing about us, because we were kind of pretty good copy, because we had the picture of the room where we drew the chip, and we made the thing work on time, and we were putting out a new price point. So we're getting a lot of publicity. And I was trying to make some things happen at the same time, like get the manuals written. And I got a phone call from Grass Valley, California, and my secretary was taking all my calls for me. And I said, gee, Grass Valley, California, as far as I know, the only thing up there is hippies and mountain men, right? So I called this guy back to say, what are you talking about? He says, well, because it's you, I'll tell you, I'm the advanced R&D for Atari's programmable game. Okay? And I think we might want to use a microprocessor. Well, he was right. And so what we did is we went to, I'm going to finish the Atari story and come back. We were actually selling products to Atari from Motorola, we put the 6800 in tank, right? And we had put PIAs in. They understood PIAs and everything, and the engineering team understood what we were trying to do from a VIA and cheaper microprocessor standpoint, but they hadn't gone where Steve was going. So we went to announce the 6502. We went to and I want to explain the things we had to do to make this work. You had to have an online coding system, right? You had to run time sharing online to be able to write code. And so a guy by the name of Mike Corder out of Iowa did that, right? We had to have a development system, and a guy who would work with me at GE by the name of Manny Lemus and his friend Terry Holt invented a thing called the Jolt, okay? At MOS Technology, there was a smart engineering manager and a smart programmer, and they were calculator guys. And so they said, well, look, we want to make a board like a calculator where you can key in the instructions and people can do something, right? You got the ability to do it. We got the RAM, ROM, IO chip. We got some VIAs and so forth. We wanted to make this product, and they called it the Kim 1. Okay? And the Kim 1 sort of became the first computer that a whole lot of people started with, including my ghost here, right? Is that right, Bill?
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
All of 4K memory.
Yeah. But the point was, it was really the first truly packaged development system, if you will. Okay? And I had the guy that helped do the original video terminal and the first BASIC. He helped me develop an ICE system. So we had to show people that we had all the tools, right? Not only did we have a cheap microprocessor, but we had all the tools. So we busted everybody's tail and got all this stuff ready for the show, including discovering a bug in the RAM-ROM chip that Pavinen had to fix over one weekend. Now, those of you who know anything about the semiconductor business don't think you can change a mask set and turn a product around in a weekend. But you can. We did.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Bill, you probably did that at MOS a couple of times.
We're proof, and we used to save half the batch just because we were known for making a mistake the first time through anyways.
Yeah. Jerry, you're talking like you know that, right?
I do, yeah, mask the ECOs.
No, but no. In the multi-plane stuff they have today, you can't do it in a day, right? Just too many.
We used to keep our 123s. We'd stick half a lot of 123s off to the side.
Yeah. Anyhow, but the point is okay. So we had scheduled a suite at the St. Francis Hotel called the MacArthur Suite, and we set it up in a big room. It's a big suite, and in each station, the Jolt was there, the Kim was there, there were guys to explain the Kim, there was a guy there with the manuals and explained the manual, the online guy came out to talk about the software. So we had this entire room, and sitting on a table at the end of the room is a big jar, okay? And in this big jar on the left-hand side is the 6502, or 6501, there's another jar, and then to the right was an I/O device, right? Okay, and then you could buy the manuals. So, but we were going to put that on the floor, and we got ready to put it on the floor, and the conference came to us and said, "We've seen your ads. We want to tell you that you're not allowed to sell anything on the floor at our conference." Oh, okay, right. So I put 3 guys on the stand, and people would come running up to them with their $25, and they would say, "You can't buy it here. Get on the bus. Go to it was one of the St. Francis, was one of the key hotels. Go to the St. Francis. Go up to the MacArthur Suite. We'll sell you a microprocessor." Right? So within one day, people were getting on the bus and asking the driver, "Is this the way to the MacArthur Suite?" Okay, we were getting far more traffic than the show was getting, and everybody came in. They got a chance to get introduced to this thing. They walked up, saw this big jar full of microprocessors to prove we had a bunch, And Bill knows the true story, that there was a thin layer of them on top and everything else underneath it was all fake. But it didn't matter. We didn't get down into the hard, we didn't get below the good layer. And a guy by the name of Steve Jobs came by and bought a 6502 at their show and went home and got Woz to design the Apple I around it. And we had made a whole bunch of people, matter of fact, people still, some guys who are a little bit older than the rest of you, come up to me and say, I have an original 6501, or I have an original 6502, or I have a Kim I bought at that show, right? You know, I mean, it's was a little bit legendary at the time, right? The thing that became more legendary for us is I went to Grass Valley right after the show, sat down with Steve Mayer from Atari, and he defined a new chip they had to develop. But he concluded that it was cheaper to use the microprocessor and our RAM-ROM I/O device than it was to design their own ASICs, right? And but they needed this one graphics chip. Now, we had signed up as a second source before we went to the show a guy I worked with that actually worked for at GE in when I was on my training program by the name of Bob Schreiner, and Pavin knew him very well. And Schreiner had a small semiconductor company ultimately sold to Honeywell. But he said, sure, you know, I'll be your second source. Well, the guys at Atari didn't trust us because we were on the East Coast, and they didn't know us very well, but they knew Schreiner, so they got a guy by the name of come on, Bill, help me.
Jay Miner.
Jay Miner, yeah. They got Jeri Miner to design the chip for them, for Steve, and we went off and in an underground way developed the first programmable game, which ultimately became the first killer application for the 6502. Right. And it all happened because of a phone call from Grass Valley. Okay, wow. So at this point, the video game is going to happen, right? Because we've got Atari, we're locked in. But we didn't have all the other things done that would make the 6502 take off, because everybody still were looking at microprocessors as being hard to design. So I took my development station and I went around the country for about 6 months, and I would tell a manager, you want a copier? We'll design, you put your engineers working with me, we'll design the entire copier in a week. All right? Because I had all the tools and I had all of the ability to do that, right? I mean, the 6502 is easy to program. For control applications, it's perfect. And so I could bang one out with my development system, and then one of the other semiconductors, I remember my buddy, one of my guys at Motorola, went to Mostec trying to sell the F8, and he said, every place I went into, these guys would tell us you did this in a week, and I would send an entire team in, and they wouldn't have it working in 3 weeks, right? Because they were working with a piece of junk, like F8. 6502 was really easy to use, and that's what everybody found, right?
I had heard an urban legend back at CBM in the old days that the registers and the use of them came from adapting them to dot matrix printers. I don't know if it's true or not, but it certainly lent itself to, X and Y were the X and Y of a dot matrix printer.
No.
I know it's urban legend, but this is the kind of things we heard.
We're gonna get around to dot matrix printers yet, right? If you guys have got the patience, okay. So at this point, we have a 6502. We have it designed into a killer application, and we get a lawsuit from my friends at Motorola, claiming we'd stolen everything we were doing from them. Remember, I had this letter? Okay, but big companies can tie little companies in big knots if they're willing to spend millions of dollars. They spend about $4 million, you have to spend $1 million, right? And so they ran me around the country for about 6 months, proving that we never violated anything. And if you look at the architecture for the 6800, you look at the architectures for the 6502, there's no similarity, right? And but there was nobody smart enough in Motorola to figure that out forever, right? We actually had to get some good lawyers to get some good experts to tell everybody, no, okay? Now, I got one last story about the 6502 instruction set. Remember, I had all this great input, but I had worked on a PDP-11, and the register structure I was using was a little too close to the PDP-11, right? And DEC was a big fancy company, and I didn't want to get sued. So I went back and bought the Carnegie Mellon study that was used to develop the 11, and I used that to prove that I was using the same baseline that they used to come up with a. And of course, the 6502, like any other the chips, didn't have the capability of the PDP-11, but it cost a hell of a lot less and was a lot smaller. But I put real index registers in, and if you've ever used it, none of you probably ever used an 11, but it has some really nice indexing capabilities.
Well, wasn't one of the ones you guys invented the indexed indirect comma y, the whole where you could write self-modifying code down in the 0-page space comma y? That's the one I remembered that didn't exist anywhere else until you did it.
No, the whole indirect thing was because of the memory. Because of the memory, and because we never stack. Right?
How many of the opcodes were?
Didn't have a stack.
How many of the opcodes were? As you were laying out the masks, you just saw some wire that you could drag over and tie in somewhere else, and
No.
It was all planned from the beginning, every opcode?
Yeah, carefully, because I knew what I needed to do to program it, right? Okay? Remember, I had all this help, right? We knew what we needed. If you look at the 6502, it's got no instructions, right? It's an accumulator-based machine, which the PDP-11 wasn't. The PDP-8 was. So it's an accumulator machine. It's got a couple real index registers. I put in indirect so that I would be able to write all kinds of self-modifying and bigger code than you can get with 8 bits, right? And the indirect also gives you an equivalent stack if you use it properly, right? If you've used the C compiler, but the C compiler uses the indirects to compensate for the lack of a stack, right, for the C. So I knew those needed to be there. Right. Remember, my background is I ran a major computing shop. I was a major designer in computers, but I was also ran a major programming shop for 10 years, right? And so I knew what programs had to do. The people designing semiconductors, microprocessor at the time, had never programmed anything, right? I mean, they programmed, and there was a language that there were people using to test things out then. I can't remember what it was. It was like ECAD, but it was something else, right? Most of them that's the only thing they knew how to do was that, and Fortran, which held the world back for a long time. I'm not a Fortran lumber gives to figure it out.
No COBOL bashing here either. It's
no. By the way, COBOL worked, right? When we were doing online payroll and stuff like that at in Evendale, right? We were running 100 locations around the country, all online, all written in COBOL, and it worked because that lady at the Navy, right? What was her name? Right?
I know who you're talking about. The woman that carried a piece of wire that had a nanosecond, right?
She was the queen of COBOL.
Yeah.
Do you remember her name?
Let's see if the chat room grabs it here.
Yeah. She carried a piece of wire that had the propagation delay of 1 nanosecond, so she knew what one looked like,
I have a question real quick while we're talking about opcodes. What was the deal with the change? There was an increment that wasn't there and then showed up in a later revision?
By the way, everybody says that. It isn't true.
Not true?
I never heard that. Yeah.
Never changed the chipset. That's an urban legend, right? Maybe we didn't have it properly documented, but
Grace Hopper.
Is that right? Yeah. She was. Yes. By the way, she was totally famous during that time, and she was She was a serious hard ass, right?
She was a character.
Serious, what?
She was a character.
No, the whole bunch of guys, she's a lieutenant in the Navy or something or other, which was hard to be at that time. But more importantly, people would try to change things and everything else, and she would just eat them up, right? And she was smart enough to eat them up, right? And it was a controlled language, and a whole lot of programs were written in it that are still running today. By the way, it was the COBOL programs that caused the problem with 2000. Going from 2000 to 2001, they had all these COBOL programs that nobody touched for 20 years, right? Everybody said, well, it's got some Fortran. I don't think so. The Fortran junk was so bad they rewrote it. But the COBOL programs, No, the guys would write these programs, and
they
then
work.
some manager would put a freeze on them and say, my payroll works. The only change you're going to get to make is under my direction when the government changes the rules on payroll. But the fundamental system they didn't allow, right? I mean, and the finance manager in most of these companies was a very important guy, and usually the MIS department worked for him. So they really did freeze a lot of that stuff. And, they froze it 20 years before, and all of a sudden, geez, it's 2000, and we didn't plan on that, right? And that's where almost all that worked. If you look, it was really done mostly to COBOL.
Right. The people are asking, there's a question about how long did you think the 6502 would go and where it would end up? And I'm going to wrap that into my own question here. Jeri, you've got some video clips, I think. Can you stick one up easily?
I can. I'll have to pull down Chuck's video.
Okay, hopefully Chuck can see it because this is integral to my question here.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Which you want me to play both videos?
Yeah, do one. Start with one.
Slight stinging sensation. All of you.
All right, freeze frame. Now run the other one real quick if you can.
So if you guys didn't see that, there's a 6502 in his brain.
Okay, freeze frame. So Chuck, here's my question for you. We all know Bender. I don't know if you know him, but his favorite hobby is kill all humans, and then the Terminator being what he was. My question is, we had a theory that you're really an evil genius that has been the destruction of the human race, and I just wanted to give you a chance to defend yourself. We see the 6502 working its way into such evil creations here.
Yeah, but it's also in almost every piece of medical equipment. Hewlett Packard uses in their if you go into a hospital, right? Look at all the intelligence that's there, and a whole lot of it's got 6502s in it.
As a toy designer, almost every toy has a 6502 in it also.
Yeah, but toys are often destructive too.
So your claim is you've saved more lives than you've cost with your evil creations. Yeah, I'll buy that. I'll buy that.
It doesn't matter, but frankly, it's sort of like I worked on the original nose cones, right, which helped save the world, and I worked on the Vulcan gun, right, which saved a lot of GI's guys' lives, right. Yeah. And so, those are weapons in the hands of people, right? And 6502 was actually used pretty lightly in anything serious, right? The military didn't use it very much, I don't think. Right.
For those that don't know, Chuck was also a Marine. I don't know what year, but he was in the service, and we have some of that in common. You'll hear us talking about some service stuff.
So let's get back to if you don't mind, you guys took me in a deviation, or was I boring you?
No, it was the people.
No, I want to explain the opcodes one more time, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you have to have a fundamental set, right? You have to be able to add and subtract, okay? And because of the tie to the calculator companies and history is why the decimal's in there. And somebody asked me, I know, I'm actually doing forget what I just said. I just started talking about a secret that I'm not going to talk about. But so we put the decimal mode in, and this is a perfect time to tell the story, right? If you don't mind, we're going to leap forward till after the PET is early marketplace, and Leonard Trammell discovers that the PET crashes about once every whatever, right? Certainly less than MS-DOS crashes. But anyhow, it was crashing. And so he went back to school to be a professor, to wind up getting his PhD in physics. And he took 6502 with him, and he spent all his time trying to find when the damn thing crashed. It didn't crash very often, and it crashed. And what he discovered is it was the last piece of code Bill Gates wrote, and Bill Gates didn't understand the 6502 had a decimal mode, and he had let it get into decimal mode and was trying to do some indexing with it.
Wow.
And, he actually crashed the PET. But it didn't happen quickly enough. What?
Needed a CLD instruction in there somewhere.
Yeah, well, yeah, Bill didn't know because not most of the other micros didn't have that mode, and he never bothered to take the time to learn. He was just helping Wyland do some code, right? Anyhow, I just thought that was a funny story because I really don't think Bill's written any code since then, and it wasn't because of that. He went on to do other bigger and better things, but anyhow, I thought it was funny that Leonard found Bill Gates' last programming error,
Cool.
and it was clear decimal, right? So no, but okay. So the decimal is kind of a funny add, but you have to have subtract and add, right? You have to have and or if you're going to do logic, right? You have to be able to shift, and we put into the O2 the ability to do a lot of those functions, shift, rotate, and that stuff in memory, because we knew we needed to do them out there, and why take them into the accumulator shifter and run them back? It's just as easy to do them out there. And so if you look at some of the more powerful instructions, they're actually doing stuff in memory that you need to do hardware with. Okay, so the answer to the question is I was doing a microprocessor to control PIAs, VIAs, and everything else to build things with. Okay, and we weren't really focusing on building a computer at all, right? I actually am a good enough programmer to understand that you don't put an 8-bit stack in something that you want to run real code with, right? But for the I/O things that we did, I just got through doing a controller using the 6502, and I'm not deep in the stack at all, right? And I'm doing multi-memory mapping, switching memories, running at USB, right? USB flash drive, and I'm probably not used a third of the stack, right? If you're not doing computing things, right, you don't use the stack. So I didn't need to have a bigger stack, and we had to meet this, and I'm going to answer Jerry's question. We spent, Pavinen and Mitch and Terry said, we can make your cost point if you keep the die size smaller than this. So we put a stake on the wall, we drew it up on the wall, and we were not allowed to let the chip get wider than that, right? And we spent a bunch of design time, including several sessions that Bill would recognize from his older days. We were drinking and doing it at my buddy's house when we came up with the special bus. Getting the registers in there, right, so that they worked, and did everything we needed to do. Gotta remember, we had one, for those of you who know anything about chip design, we had one layer of metal, right?
Right.
All you guys nowadays get like 7, right?
Yeah. Layer 6.
Whatever, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is we had one layer of metal, so we managed metal like it was our best friend, right? Every decision on metal had to be made by the team, right? So that was why we wound up with special bus. We had to add another bus, and we were able to break a bus, right, the one that was driving the address lines, at the adder, and then run it on the other side called special bus. And most of you don't even know that, but it was really an important step because it let us bring the index registers in at the same time we were doing other stuff. Okay? And it seems pretty trivial, like all the other stuff. Once you do it, it seems trivial, but that was important. All right, so now we've got the bottom half of the chip almost laid out, and the top half of the chip is a ROM. If you were to look at it under picture, you'll see that there's only a ROM up there. There's a little bit of control logic, but it's fundamentally a big ROM. And Bill Mensch came to me in Wilmathis one day, and he said, you guys have got 20 ROM lines too many. I got the opcodes done, I got everything I want, right? And I'm 20 lines too wide. And somebody said we can make the chip wider. And we said, no, we're not going to make the chip wider. We agreed we're going to make this chip this size so I can hold the process guy's feet to the table. So Will and I locked up in a room and optimized that character set, that chip set. I mean the opcode set, and took out 20 lines so that we'd make the size. So now it was definitely not random. It was very carefully planned. We were only looking at the ROM code during that time, and then I knew how I was going to hook up to the register section, so that happened afterwards. But
did that cause the the illegal opcodes, as everyone likes to call it? Doing all
Probably.
this?
Yeah, because we were doing don't cares, right? And so therefore, if you select another opcode, it don't cares somewhere down a path, right? Because we needed to be able to get don't cares in order to be able to get, we had to take 4 lines and make them one, and you do that by having some don't cares, right? And I claim, I just had a big argument with the guy with this chip I was designing because he wanted to do something that worked around programming errors, and I said, listen, programmers always make errors. The reason they program is because they make errors because they feel so good when they fix them. And and so therefore we want to give the programmers a chance to screw up, right? And so we did.
Yeah. I always told the chip guys that the programmers before the end of the day would be their best friends, because at the end of the day it was going to be the programmers that fixed all of our mistakes in time for production.
Yeah, well, more important, I wasn't kidding. It's because I've had a chance to study programmers, and I studied programmers from the beginning, right, when we were trying to figure out how to make programming more efficient and everything. The joy of being a programmer is the same joy you get when you complete a puzzle, right? I mean, it doesn't work, it's a piece of crap, I hate it. Oh, look how beautiful I just did, right? Tell me how you get that kind of joy in real life. You got to be a physician, right, and save lives, right, to get the same kind of feeling. And so now I just gave away one of my secrets why we went in the computer business, right? We were bringing joy to people for money. There's another set of words that go along with that
Right.
we won't go into. But seriously, the opcodes were very optimized. They were all designed around this original Carnegie Mellon and this stuff I got when I was still at Motorola. And I then wrote a whole bunch of code personally. I probably wrote more code the first year than anybody else, and never found a limitation that I couldn't get around easily. In fact, I used to write benchmarks against all the other guys for the magazines and kick their butt, right? The look-ahead stuff we did with the 6502, the fact that it was so simple, meant that and the fact that we had real registers, real index registers and stuff like that, their stuff takes, if you look at some of the cycles on the original 8080 and stuff like that, it just took forever to do something. And Motorola had the problem that they couldn't really do an index register, right? So and by the way, if you're writing real code, you need index registers, right? Particularly with an 8-bit bus and small memory, right?
Yeah.
So we had a chance to have about a year to do the plan, and then we took about 9 months to do the chip, and it worked, right? And then after that it was just a question of selling it. Okay.
And the 5 people we called you guys the Gang of 5 in the old days. Can you mention the names of the people?
Okay,
that
I'd
were on
like
that
to,
team?
if you don't mind. This is a perfect time, and we're going to just give the credit where credit was due. I've already talked about Terry Holt, who ultimately wound up running a company called Chips and Technology just before he retired. He did a bunch of other stuff in between times, but he was John Pavinen came out, helped me start Victor, then has been doing consulting for a bunch of venture capital companies ever since then. By the way, John was older than me, okay, just for the record. McLaughlin, who did the Kim, was also older than me, but they were not as instrumental as the other guys who were younger. Bill Minch, I think I've talked about, and if I haven't talked about him enough, I'll talk about him again, right? Rod Original was a cowboy who was living in Phoenix because he liked being a cowboy. He got hooked up with doing the 6800 as kind of a second, and he was treated like a second-class citizen, but he's a smart guy. So I talked him into coming back to Pennsylvania with me, which he hated. He finally wound up going back to Colorado with HP. But he actually drove the register section. He's the one that he knew enough, because he'd worked on the Biotron stuff and he'd worked on the 6800 and everything. He knew what we needed to do to make the registers work, and that was really important. Because Bill, irrespective of the fact that he ultimately took the 6502 and carried it on forever, didn't really get it. during that time. Rod did. Will Mathis went to work for GE Motorola in Phoenix, coming out of making electronic safes for whoever the guys are. You go up to a bank and you drop your stuff in at night, just before ATMs. This is the electronic safes that you go put your stuff in, and that's what he was doing. So he was like me. He knew why we were doing this, right? And so Will was my backup on the logic design, and he was Rod's backup because he helped Rod actually. He taught himself circuit design enough to be able to help get the register section working. I'm going to give two other designers, and I'm going to talk about another engineer. Just lost his name for a second. A guy by the name of Harry Bockham, who was crazy, had his own airplane, had his own kayak, did everything off the page, but if you get him sitting in front of a layout, he was just great, right? I don't know where Harry wound up. A guy by the name of Mike James that we brought in later, who was very instrumental in hurting us in the Motorola lawsuit, because he doesn't listen. But again, really good layout guy. Ray Hurt was the other engineer, Ray Young engineer, who was kind of Bill Minch's understudy at MOS Technology, and helped Bill Minch start his company in Phoenix, and ultimately went to work for Intel. Did I forget anybody else? Okay, let's talk about the people at MOS Technology that were crucial. Don McLaughlin was the engineering manager. He and Bob Winterhalt were the vendors of the Kim 1. John Pavin, I think I've talked about. The third partner was a guy by the name of Mort Jaffe, who provided the financing. And without those guys being willing to gamble on me, there never would have been a 6502. So I owe them everything. Luckily, I made them pretty rich, because they got Commodore stock when they sold their company, and they hung onto the stock when we ran the Commodore stock up, and so they all walked away very wealthy. And then John got to take Victor stock and go away. But my point was that when they did this, there was nothing, right? I didn't have a team, I didn't have anything, just an idea. So great guys, really appreciate it. There was a guy at MOS Technology who was the mask set designer, who was working with the projection alignment that Pavin was so much in love with. And I can't remember his name. I'll try to remember it. If I find it, I will. Maybe you knew it, right? Did you? The guy that used to do those really pretty pictures, Bill? The stuff we put up on the wall?
No, I don't know.
No, he left when all of the other transitions occurred. But he made the masks, and he made it work, right? I mean, so there were obviously other people, but those were the key ones in the 6502 days. My two assistants, Jill and Nancy, were both just absolutely important. They saved me. And I really got to give the first of about 10 pieces of credit to a very key guy by the name of Peter Senal. Peter helped me start Intelligent Terminal Systems. He worked with me, and he and I did the first automated layout of a PC board at General Electric Company in 1965. He was the West Coast sales manager and managed Apple, Atari, all of this sort of stuff for us. Joined me at Commodore when we did the PET, and helped me get the original PET done, particularly the Kim 1. He took a Kim 1 into production. He joined me at Victor, and was one of the key guys in making Victor happen. Then he and some guys spun out and started a design company, and then he got cancer and died. Very sad. He was out of the Czech Institute. We actually, GE had a bunch of guys that came over from Czechoslovakia. They all escaped at the same time, and they went to work in Phoenix, so that their families weren't going to get beaten up by the Czech government, because they were working in a non-defense industry. And so Peter was just everything we did. Peter sat down with me when we sat down and defined the basic. I mean, he had tremendous background in hardware, and his mechanical skills is the reason we were able to do the original PET. Just a key guy. he was the first guy that I brought in who got a foul of Jack Tramiel, and Jack Tramiel fired him about a month before we got the pet going. For maybe because he was Czech, I don't know. But as I said, Peter was a very important guy. I got one small story, and then we'll get on, leave MOS technology and go on to into the computer. I had taken on the commitment to write the manuals for the 6502, which ultimately became pretty famous. And Peter had joined us and was in Pennsylvania, and he kept bugging me because I was answering phone calls and getting involved with design and everything else. We weren't getting the manual done. So he went into John Pavinen and said, if you don't kick Chuck out of the building, we'll never get this done. So Pavinen calls me in his office and says, I've instructed the guards, you're not allowed in this building until Peter Samuel says you can come back. And so I had to go home and write the manual, and then Peter would come over to my house and take it back and put it in real English, even though he was Czech and I wasn't. I was theoretically New English. And between the two of us, we turned out this manual. It's just funny dynamics. But 9 months, start to finish, on time, on schedule, on price, introduced, changed the world. I want to make one last statement about 6502, and then let's move on to Commodore. The idea was to do a microprocessor that would let you, now we'd already done the PIA and we got the other stuff done, that would let you do anything you wanted to do with this combination. And because of it, other people had to react, right? Intel had to do theirs and everything else. And without doing that, we wouldn't have all of the wonderful things we have today, right? The cheap micro, cheap I/O made everything else possible. There's no electronics today. There's no airplanes flying. There's no cars running. None of that stuff without lots of microprocessors. And they happened because we drove the price point to where it should be, and then we gave them a product that worked. And so Bill Lynch figured out there's 5 billion 6502s been sold. But it isn't just 6502. The PIA and its derivative hardware is in every machine that you buy. So it was a very important time in history, and truly proud of it. Okay.
And that's where some of that revisionism's coming in, where it's again some of the just hooking up these pieces in the way they were designed to be hooked up, and that's what changed the world, and that's what I kind of disagree with. I go back to your version of the beginning here, and it's
cool. Wait a minute. We did make that available because we knew why we were making it available, right? I mean, come on, guys. I mean, it's a product that was designed with that plan, right? And so the guy says, well, gee, I used it. I made a breakthrough. Okay. That's what you were supposed to do, right?
Right.
I mean, Steve Mayer's the perfect example. He made the Atari programmable game work because he took the pieces and he added his own little piece, and they created the video game business, which has been an enormous business. All right.
The only add-on piece that was left was the video controllers themselves. That was, everything else was cast in.
That's what Meyer had Jay do, right? And MOS tried to do their own, and Jay kicked their butt, right? And they well, no, but see, okay, let's do Commodore for half a second.
Let's do Commodore. Let's do Toy.
No. But what I'm saying is the VIC-20 used the controller that Carpenter and those guys tried to put in the video business. Coleco put a couple people, but I told them at the time they were doing it because I couldn't tell them what they were doing wrong because it was under confidentiality agreement with Atari. But I said, you guys shouldn't even be working on this. You're going to get your butts kicked, right? And they did. But it was good enough for the VIC-20. And the work that Charpentier and those guys learned, right, made the 64, right? With the C64, the difference between the C64 and the PET and the CBM and everything else was the video controller, right? And that was a key element, right? And that was the key element of video games. That's what, they used the 6516 and 6502 forever in all of these games that everybody came up with different, right? But they were just making better video, right? But that wasn't something my team did. That was something that the guys at MS Technology did, right? And did it well, ultimately.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they wouldn't have done it well if they hadn't listened to Seiler, right? So let's get into the pet and
Talk
give
about Bill
Seiler
Seiler.
credit. Right. We're gonna get into that. All right. Remember I told you that I was going around designing microprocessors into everything? Well, I got the assignment to go down to these guys that were the original rip-off guys that ripped off the Pong and put in the bars and got very rich and famous. And they were in the arcade business, and they were making pinball. They were heavy pinball guys. And I made a brag I could make a better pinball game out of my 6502 product than any pinball game they had. So they challenged me, come on down and do it. And so I locked up in their basement and had a bunch of guys teach me what was good about pinball. And Jeri says she's a real sophisticated pinball player, so she knows what I'm talking about. You don't do pinball just by doing pinball, right? I mean,
there's a lot to it.
Yeah, you have to. No, the pinball guys are absolutely artistes, and they demand tools to make artiste things with, right? And so that was great. I learned a lot about pinball. But more importantly, I'm sitting there at night designing computers. That's when I designed them at night because there was nobody around to bother me. And there's this guy whose job it was to make car noises for the mechanical arcade. Most of you don't remember that when you went into an arcade, you sat in this device and it kind of whirled around and you heard noises and you turned steering wheels and the screen showed you something, but it was fundamentally more mechanical and more sound generation. And that's what he was doing, he's making car noises. And he was working on a suiting hobby computer, right? And he finished it while I was there. And he's so excited. It plays the Star Spangled Banner, and it shows the Star Spangled Banner on the screen. I said, okay, now what are you going to do with it? He says, I don't know. I wanted to build one. It works. And he ultimately went out and put BASIC on it and played around with BASIC a little bit. And Bill Gates says, and I believe it's a true story, that Seiler is the only guy who ever wrote to Gates when Gates was selling BASIC and said, I'm paying you for a BASIC that I stole. One of the guys at the computer club, the hobby club, gave me a copy of your BASIC, and I feel bad about it, so he paid Gates. And that was so memorable that when we started doing business with Gates, he remembered Seiler's name and remembered that Seiler did that. Okay. So here's this guy, smart guy, who's built this thing, right? And, okay, I'm done, right? And that was what was going on in the hobby business during that time. The guys that were building them were building them for the same reason that they built kit cars or kit anything. They wanted to have a computer that they built, right? And most of them didn't have a clue what they wanted to do with it. And by the way, the software that was available, they couldn't do anything anyhow, right? So I'm going around the country preaching the choir, preaching the story about microprocessors and how important they are. And just like when I was doing the other one, people come up with me. People were coming up to me. We would talk about the Kim 1 and how useful it was, and there'd be somebody in the audience would say, geez, I just did this with a Kim 1. Another guy in the audience would say, I did that with a Kim 1. And the programmer would look at it and say, what the hell's a Kim 1? And I don't want to do it because it doesn't do anything for me, right? To write in Octal and, all that crap, right? So they would say, what I want is a turnkey system that lets me write code of my own for myself, right? And I can't build a computer, and everybody that's built one can't use it, right? Well, there was a clear-cut message there. And so I listened again, right? Here's these guys saying what I want. And so remember my background. We talked about BASIC, we talked about time sharing, we talked about what's happening. I was one of the few people that knew about all that. I mean, none of the guys in the hobby computer business knew about all that stuff. But it was obvious to me that what people wanted was the same thing they had with time sharing. They want an online BASIC system, but only on their desk. And there's their own, and they can use it. And you don't have to go put some punch cards into some guy that's got them locked out of the computer room. And they'll pay money for that function, okay? If I give it to them in a way that they can use it, not the hobbyists, not the engineers, but the finance guys, the people that were using the computers, writing basic programs. They were computer literate, but they didn't want to have to deal with all this other stuff. So I put together a quick plan, and right about that time, Jack Trammell from Commodore bought MOS Technology, because MOS Technology made the best calculator chips in the world because of what they were doing, projection alignment, and they had a bunch of guys that were really good at calculators. And Trammell had made some money the previous year in a very tough market by running his own semiconductor company. And so he figured these guys in MOS have the biggest, best chips, and they're willing to sell the company cheap because their backer, Alan Bradley, pulled out. Okay? So he came in, he bought the company to make high-end P-channel calculator chips, which, like several other Jack's buys, was a really dumb decision, because 1 year later, the Japanese came out with the CMOS calculator and the CMOS watch, and Jack went out of all those businesses. But okay, so he's now bought MOS Technology. At MOS Technology, at Commodore, was this guy by the name of Andre Suzanne, who actually worked involved with another calculator company. And Andre had a vision about a personal computer that could be sold on a mass production basis, right? So he convinced Jack that I was on the right track. I moved back to Pennsylvania. From Pennsylvania to Palo Alto with Andre's blessing and support. And Jack said, this is like September, he says the CES show is in January. Now, Bill remembers CES shows, okay? And if you can make a program, if you can make a personal computer I can show at that show, I'll back you. Okay, now this is dead stop, nothing working, nothing done, totally new team, right? And we had to design it, get ready for the CES show.